The collective West, or better yet, the neocon foreign policy establishment, is admitting that the Ukrainian offensive is essentially defeated. And this should have been well understood. This should have been something to be expected if rational minds and if people in the West and people around the world were properly informed. Ukraine didn't go into this offensive with advantages. It had already burned through multiple armies, and there had been warnings up into or coming up into the counteroffensive that showed that perhaps this was not going to go as planned. And of course, during the NATO summit, there was a lot of consternation among NATO members about not how to continue to support Ukraine. That was never off of the table. But it was quite clear that the goings on, the drama, the fact that Zelensky was talking out of the side of his mouth, being left alone, lambasting, and he's continuing to do this, lambasting his overseers and his masters in the collective West, that all of this should have pointed to the fact that Ukraine is not in a good position at the moment. But this runs contrary to everything we have heard in the Western mainstream media up until this point. And now you have Joe Biden about to send 24 billion US dollars to Ukraine for security assistance, economic aid, humanitarian assistance, etc., essentially to continue to prop up a government that was always a puppet of the United States, always a puppet of NATO, and is being used to do NATO's dirty work. So the collective West and its media, its mainstream Western media, its corporate-owned media, is now admitting that the Ukrainian offensive is defeated. And Brian Berletic had a great video to show us exactly how the Western mainstream media is doing this. And I'm going to play what he had to say first, and then I'm going to get into articles that I have pulled up to show kind of a timeline of how this has transpired. Because it isn't just now that this has been going on. The warning signs have been there since the very beginning. That's a very unflattering picture. Let me get to Brian. But it isn't just now. There has been warnings from the very beginning as the Ukrainian offensive was being said to be ready to launch. It was delayed. It was delayed. It was delayed. And the warnings were coming. So I'm going to show you a timeline of that. And before that, let's get into what Brian had to say.
And we are now in the third month of fighting amid this Ukrainian offensive. And I want to take a look at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. This is a pro-Ukrainian live map. So keep that in mind when we look at it, and we can see that the line of contact has barely changed. There's been hardly any changes in the line of contact. We see these red rifle icons. This means that Russian forces are on the advance. And we see areas here, Robotino. This was supposedly taken by Ukraine, according to this map. That has not been confirmed. As a matter of fact, it has been confirmed that that did not happen. And they are even indicating rifle icons, red rifle icons, indicating Russian forces are in these areas, not Ukrainian forces. If we zoom out, we can see that there are these long-range attacks in Crimea. We've heard about the drone attacks on shipping through the Black Sea, also on Russian naval vessels, and we see a steady stream of news stories about these drone attacks in and around Moscow.
So that's been happening. I haven't had much time to cover that because every time they're happening, I am not going live. But indeed, as what I believe in active desperation, Ukraine has been launching over and over and over again these attempted drone attacks on Russian territory. Of course, the naval fleet, the oil fleet that was sailing through the Black Sea, that was targeted, and of course on Moscow and other areas of Russia, most of them being intercepted or downed before any damage is done. And of course, Crimea has been targeted over and over and over again. But this has escalated the more that Ukraine's counteroffensive has stalled. And that's what has happened. It has stalled. There has not been any movement, and as you saw from the UA map, that is exactly what the map is showing.
And this is because the offensive has stopped. It is ground to a halt. Ukrainian forces are not making the progress they expected to. They need to demonstrate to the world that somehow they have the initiative, and they are doing so by carrying out these attacks. But in terms of strategically hindering Russia's military operations in Ukraine, these attacks do nothing to accomplish that. They are purely for political value. The offensive is in such a bad state right now that even the Western media is beginning to admit something is wrong. Let's look at this article here from Vox. What went wrong in Ukraine's counteroffensive and what's changed now? And that kind of suggests the possibility that things are better. But if you actually read through the article, it is extremely bleak. The article says Ukraine had tried to tamp down expectations about the counteroffensive long before it had begun. Their own expectations that it would be wildly successful. They ended up having to tamp that down before it began. But Kiev's past successes and Moscow's past failures, the deliveries of new advanced Western weapons, and a fresh crop of Western-trained Ukrainian recruits had all had a lot of folks very hyped, maybe overly so, about what Kiev could achieve. But that would only have worked if you took that at face value and you didn't think about any of these things they were talking about, these so-called successes by Ukraine. I'm going to get into that. And again, they're referring to Kharkov and Kherson last year.
Yes, and I'm not going to get into that in his video. So those are the successes last year, last summer, the summer offensive that Ukraine waged, that supposedly they took all this territory and it was so impressive. But what they did was they burned through an entire army in order to hold a small amount of territory. Russia retreated based on its own principles of waging a war of attrition. And then Ukraine was a sitting duck. And that's why Ukraine has not only been able to make any gains, but has actually had to cede more from Russia because Russia has the advantage militarily now. But let's continue.
The supposed mistakes that Russia made. They're talking about the withdrawal from, say, Kiev, or the withdrawal from Snake Island. All of these instances that have been misinterpreted by Western analysts, by the Western media, by Western military and political leaders, all of these misinterpretations helped fuel the misconception that this Ukrainian offensive was going to be much more successful than it actually has turned out to be. The article continues. It says, Western equipment can withstand a lot, but vast minefields are vast minefields, and Kiev and its newly trained forces have largely failed at conducting combined arms operations on a large scale. That is, coordinating troops and all this different weaponry like armored vehicles and artillery to blitz through Russian lines. Kiev has also suffered high casualties in its attempts to do so. Ukraine knows this and has now shifted strategies to a much more attritional approach, trying to degrade Russian forces and logistics as it focuses its operations on 3 axes of attack.
So now Ukraine is waging a war of attrition, according to the Western mainstream media. This is how desperate things are becoming. This is not the strategy that Ukraine has been pursuing throughout. What has Ukraine said? What has the US and NATO said? This is a war, an all-out war to take back territory, to expel the so-called Russian invader, and to do that as quickly as possible. A war of attrition means you are fighting, you are grinding, and you are doing so with the expectation that defeat will come to your enemy when they are worn down, when they have been slowed down, and when they can no longer fight. That is not how Ukraine has supposedly been fighting this war. It's been fighting this war as a total all-out effort to eradicate a so-called occupier. Of course, we know the circumstances are different. They are not that. That is not the overall circumstances that Ukraine found itself in. It's always been a proxy of the United States since the coup in 2014. It's always been a military outpost. It's the porcupine that's meant to prickle Russia. And it was all about waging an ongoing and escalating war against Russia on behalf of NATO. But the fact is that now the Western mainstream media has to try to spin this as some kind of war of attrition for Ukraine, and nothing could be further from the truth.
And now here's a New York Times article, very, very similar in nature. It's not a sprint, Ukraine's Marines insist. It's a marathon. Journalists from the Times spent 2 weeks with troops from brigades trained and supplied by NATO to get their take on how and where the counteroffensive is going. The article says they all have a strong sense of urgency. We have to do this fast, one said, but they also warned that the fight would be long and hard. A lot of people thought it would be very fast, and in the autumn, we thought we would be in Crimea. But every meter of the tree line is very difficult. It's not a sprint, it is a marathon. However, to believe all of this, to believe that Ukraine can shift from trying to storm Russian defenses to an attritional approach, or to think that they can turn this into a marathon rather than achieve everything in a sprint. This is as flawed as thinking the offensive was going to be successful in the first place. There was a very specific reason why Ukraine and their NATO sponsors chose to storm Russian positions rather than conduct this as an attritional marathon. There's a very specific reason. We all know what that reason is. They lack the trained manpower, the armor, the artillery, and the ammunition to draw this out in a long attritional way. This is how Russia prefers to fight. This is how Russia prepared for this conflict.
So that's all I need to play from the video, because there is a lot more to it than this, but this sets the stage. Brian set the stage for how the Western mainstream media is now talking about the conflict. And you see the New York Times there going back and forth. It's a marathon. No, it's a sprint. We need to go as fast as possible. But actually, things are going to be really difficult for Ukraine, and the results are playing out. It is really difficult for Ukraine. There is no sprint. There is going to be no total victory in a matter of months. There isn't going to be the taking back of any territory. They haven't even penetrated the front lines, as the UA map had shown. But I want to now show you one of the more recent admissions, and this comes from CNN, and it was published not too long ago on August 8th, okay? And it says that Western allies receive increasingly sobering, and they put it in quotes, so you got to love the Western mainstream media for always being willing to spin things in a direction that is not the truth. But they received sobering updates on Ukraine's counteroffensive. This is the most difficult time of the war. So, weeks into Ukraine's highly anticipated counteroffensive, Western officials describe increasingly sobering assessments about Ukrainian forces' ability to retake significant territory. This is from 4 senior U.S. and Western officials briefed on the latest intelligence to CNN. And let me just change the formatting a bit as we go along to make it bigger for all of you. So, they're still going to see for the next couple of weeks if there's a chance of making some progress. But for them to really make progress would be to change the balance of this conflict. And I think that's extremely and highly unlikely. A senior Western diplomat, of course they're unnamed, told CNN. An Illinois Democrat, Mike Quigley, said, "Our briefings are sobering. We're reminded of the challenges they face. This is the most difficult time of the war." So that's a different narrative than what we were being told when the counteroffensive was building up. We were told that Ukraine is prepared, Ukraine is ready. There were all sorts of debates about whether Ukraine should go after Crimea. All of this feels like a pipe dream as of right now. The primary challenge for Ukraine, the article continues, is the continued difficulty of breaking through Russia's multi-layered defense lines in the eastern and southern parts of the country, which are marked by tens of thousands of mines and vast networks of trenches. Ukrainian forces have incurred staggering losses there, leading Ukrainian commanders to hold back some units to regroup and reduce casualties. Russians have a number of defensive lines, said a senior diplomat, that haven't really gone through the first line. Even if they would keep on fighting for the next several weeks, if they haven't been able to make more breakthroughs throughout the last 7 or 8 weeks, what is the likelihood that they will suddenly, with more depleted forces, make them now? Conditions are so hard. A senior U.S. official said the U.S. recognizes the difficulties Ukrainian forces are facing, though retains hope for renewed progress. We all recognize this is going harder and slower than anyone would like, including the Ukrainians, but we still believe there's time and space for them to make progress. So John Kirby, the White House National Security Council coordinator for strategic communications, addressed the speed of Ukraine's counteroffensive on that Tuesday, telling Wolf Blitzer of CNN's Situation Room that, quote, even the Ukrainians, including President Zelensky, have said they're not going as far or fast as they would like, end quote. While they're making progress, it's incremental and it's slow and it's not without its difficulties, but they keep trying and they're still at it. There's active fighting along that front. They are definitely trying to push forward. How far they'll get, what that will be, what kind of breakthrough they might be able to achieve, I don't think anybody can say right now. We've got to make sure we're staying behind them and supporting them. So this is the admission. This is not going well. They're trying to, you see John Kirby trying to play this communications chief. He's trying to play public relations. He's trying to massage our minds into thinking that actually progress could be made. But as Brian showed from the live view A map, there is no progress being made. So they're even trying to lie their way into a kind of narrative spin so that we will believe the opposite of the truth. Surprise, surprise. This is neocon Foreign Policy 101. Western officials also say the slow progress has exposed the difficulty of transforming Ukrainian forces into combined mechanized fighting units, sometimes with as few as 8 weeks of training on Western-supplied tanks or other new weapon systems. The lack of progress on the ground is one reason Ukrainian forces have been striking more often inside Russian territory to try and show Russian vulnerability, said a U.S. senior military official. So there you have it, an admission that these attacks on Russia are desperate. These are desperate attacks. They're trying to show vulnerability to public opinion. They're trying to make it seem like they still have a dog in this fight, when in fact they have been tamed. They have been brought to heel, to use the absolutely ridiculously awful and disgusting rhetoric, and spin it on its head, turn it on its head, of Hillary Clinton. Our soldiers are doing their best. The enemy is conducting active assault actions in a number of directions, but is not succeeding, said Valery Zaluzhny, who told that to Mark Milley, according to a readout issued by the Ukrainian government. Talking about the situation in the south, where Ukrainian forces have struggled to gain ground, Zaluzhny said heavy fighting continues. Ukrainian troops step by step continue to create conditions for advancing. The initiative is on our side. So again, there's a lot of denial here too. This is not going to be, and we should never expect people who are so indebted to a neocon war, to a permanent war on behalf of the U.S. hegemon, that people like Valery Zaluzhny would just go out and admit that everything is terrible and we're defeated. No, but you can see the spin here. Things are difficult, but we're trying hard. We're pushing forward. We're doing our best. And we're making necessary sacrifices, on and on and on. Some officials fear, though, that the widening gap between expectations and results will spark a blame game among Ukrainian officials and their Western supporters, which may create divisions within an alliance which has remained intact for nearly 2 years into the war. The problem, of course, here is the prospect of the blame game, that the Ukrainians would then blame it on us. Last month, at the Aspen Security Forum, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pointed out that the slow arrival of advanced weapon systems from the West was the reason for Ukrainian forces' slow progress so far. Zelensky said that, quote, we did plan to start the counteroffensive in the spring, but we didn't, because frankly, we have not enough munitions and armaments and not enough properly trained brigades. I mean, properly trained in these weapons. So there you have it. I mean, this is what has been going on. There has been an ongoing propaganda assault to try to convince us that Ukraine has a chance here and that it should keep pushing forward. But even Vladimir Zelensky, in his temper tantrums, in his attempt to complain and whine his way into even further armament, it has stated, has told his overseers that it hasn't been enough. Zaluzhny, the entirety of Ukraine's defense ministry, they've all said it. They've all said that it just has not been enough. And there's a big reason for that. It's because Ukraine burns through what the collective West provides. And of course, the collective West, especially the United States, has been very careful, and I have covered it here. There have always been concerns, and you all may know that the United States is a hegemon. It is not there to just serve Ukraine. The United States has a war machine that is not just geared toward this one conflict. The proxy war on Russia in Ukraine is but one facet of a global militarist agenda, one that is incredibly expansive, trillions of dollars, 800 plus military bases, hundreds of thousands of troops scattered about the world. This is not just about Ukraine. So the U.S. is very concerned that if it gives everything to Ukraine, it won't have anything left to fight China or to, I don't know, now there's all this drama in Niger with Niger threatening to kick out France and even the United States. So how can the United States fight other wars if it's giving everything to Ukraine? Well, this has been a concern for quite some time. And this issue of ammunition, of weaponry to Ukraine has been one that has been on the on the radar of the collective West, the neocon foreign policy establishment across the collective West for quite some time. So before the counteroffensive even started, and this is the timeline I want to go through, I want to show you how the collective West has been thinking about this and how they've been talking about it for several months. This was written in May 2023, a full month before the counteroffensive even started. And this was written toward the end of the spring. And of course, we all know that this was supposed to be the spring offensive, and it ended up being a summer offensive that now is looking like it has been defeated. So in this commentary, so this is a Bloomberg, James Stavridis. And James Stavridis is a former military official, I believe. Let me see. No, he's an opinion columnist, but he's a retired U.S. Navy admiral, a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and of course, an academic for the global military machine. But what he had to say was that Ukraine is running out of ammo, and so is the United States. But look at the next headline, or the subheadline. The West is better at producing weapons, but also faces global supply chain problems. So this has been the back and forth from the foreign policy establishment. It has been, well, we're in trouble and we can't avoid talking about that. And in places like Bloomberg, or this is republished from Japan Times, in places like Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, they're written for investors, they're written for the elite. They can't hide everything from them. So they need to roll out little nuggets and kernels of truth. And here you'll see a struggle, kind of a cognitive dissonance of sorts, that shows how desperate the situation has been for several months, not just now, but there was concerns this was always going to be a problem for the offensive. So as the war in Ukraine rages, and with Kiev's forces likely to begin an offensive any day now, and of course it started a full month after this article was written, both sides are now facing shortages of ammunition, electronic components, precision-guided weapons, and even cement. And so this was during the both sides argument. Of course, now we know that Russia is not having any kind of weapons shortages. It has continued to pummel Ukrainian forces. It has continued to demilitarize Ukraine. It is not running out of missiles or any other kind of weaponry. It is fighting this war of attrition exactly how it wants. But while the West has a vastly larger overall capability to deliver, you hear the chest thumping here, the necessities of combat snarls in the global commercial supply chain are beginning to manifest. The real spring offensive may not be tanks and armor, but upscaled weapons productions in the factories of Ukraine's democratic supporters. What should they be doing collectively to make sure Ukrainians get what they need to turn back Russia's illegal and immoral invasion? What will be the impact on the broader global supply chain? So even now, the thesis of this argument is, or article, is that the West has to do more. It needs more weaponry because it's out of weaponry. This was just a fancy way of saying they don't have enough. So as a North Atlantic Treaty Organization's military commander over a decade ago, I would often look deep into logistics and supply chains as I contemplated our combat operations, aka wars, in Afghanistan, the Balkans, Libya, and counter piracy. We felt comfortable that the overall Western defense industrial base, which supports 1.2 trillion in collective military budgets for 31 NATO nations, could handle these conflicts with relative ease. So there you have an admission that these smaller countries, and with the combined arsenal of what NATO had in stock, that it wasn't hard to fight wars against Afghanistan and Libya because these countries didn't have militaries to fight back. And so what he says is that, but what made me nervous a decade ago was the possibility of great power conflict in Europe, despite the fact that they were always dripping and drooling from the mouth wanting it, but notably a potential flare-up with the Russian Federation. While the Democratic allies enjoy overwhelming capability and inventory advantage, Russia's total military budget is under 70 billion, 1/10 of NATO's at best. The Russians have a competent industrial base, lots of raw materials, and can draw on conscript labor to man the machines in the foundries and factories. So don't you just love the hubris of Mr. Stavridis, this former Navy admiral and also NATO commander, who is thumping his chest about how much NATO is superior to Russia, then says, well, actually, I'm kind of nervous about what Russia has in stock and in store for us if we were to do something, or if we were to continue on this path with Ukraine. So while NATO is more than a year out of Afghanistan, the huge needs of Ukraine are driving challenges in supplying material to combat operations at a level I didn't anticipate. The need for electronic components in particular to build precision-guided weapons, sophisticated drones, anti-ship cruise missiles, and so-called smart artillery rounds is soaring. Despite the sluggish global economy, civilian firms are competing with Western militaries for the crucial semiconductor chips, particularly high-end ones produced largely in Taiwan. And here you see why also it is so important for the United States and for NATO to expand out to the Pacific and to target Taiwan as a proxy for war with China because of this semiconductor shortage in need. The United States is worried about losing its advantages. Western car manufacturers and heavy equipment producers, from Caterpillar to GM, General Motors, are feeling the pinch. Cement in high demand in the U.S. for the infrastructure projects just beginning to come online from the bipartisan infrastructure law is getting scarce as Ukrainian war needs rise for reconstruction. A number of analyses and war simulations are trying to project critical pain points. Guns, missiles, ammunitions, especially howitzer shells, are not of most concern. Notable among stockpiles running low are the 155 millimeter gun rounds that have emerged as a key offensive punch for the Ukrainians. Several analysts believe that Ukraine is burning through a year's worth of U.S. pre-war production monthly. So this has been a major problem for the United States, for NATO, is that Ukraine is firing shells. It is burning through its weaponry at a pace monthly of what the U.S. and NATO countries can supply and produce annually. So while the DoD, the Department of Defense, will continue to protect its own war reserves, the excess armament levels stockpiled for contingencies beyond basic needs of the U.S. war plans are very low. And it's not just howitzer rounds. The high-performance HIMARS rockets are in short supply as well, for example. The defense industrial base is stepping up production, taking a page out of the U.S. military industrial complex, they should say, at the start of World War II. As Yale historian Paul Kennedy outlines in his brilliant books, Engineers of Victory, about the technology, organization, and war production that turned the tide of the war, the Allies eventually outproduced the Axis. While we are far from total mobilization of the 1940s, both the big defense primes, and many smaller producers of high-tech systems are rapidly innovating and producing what Ukrainians will need in the months ahead. But as new orders have increased, another problem has emerged: a severe shortage of skilled munitions workers. So here again is this, oh, well, things are really bad, but there is some hope. except we don't have what we need to materialize that hope. So these are the warnings, okay? And I don't have to read the rest. There's only a couple more paragraphs. In a sense, what he is saying is Ukraine needs more. The United States needs to spend more on weaponry, on producing more weaponry, on increasing its stockpiles so that it doesn't have to dip into reserves. This is a familiar narrative that we've heard over and over and over again. So during this counteroffensive, right now you're having the neocons on CNN, right? They're talking about how things aren't going well. There's trouble ahead. There's trouble now. Ukraine has slowed down. It's stalled. There's no satisfaction on any side with how things are going. Now, the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal wrote a very interesting editorial last month, which again indicated that this is not a new problem. So America is running out of ammo, says the Wall Street Journal. Biden admits that the problem, but why not do something about it? So here you have, again, the same issue. And this should all point to what now is being admitted by the neocon foreign policy establishment months later, a month later, months later, is that the problems were easily predictable, that this problem of ammunition, this problem of just getting another Ukrainian military armed was a huge issue, and it was not going to be resolved in this offensive. So President Biden is taking flack for sending cluster bombs to Ukraine over the weekend, where he blurted out the truth that both Kiev and the U.S. are running low on firepower. So why doesn't the commander-in-chief unveil a new national effort to expand U.S. weapons production and stocks? The Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, said Joe Biden on CNN. This is a war relating to munitions. They're running out of ammunition, and we're low on it. The U.S. is giving Kiev more than 2 million 155 millimeter rounds, and the Pentagon says Ukraine is burning through 3,000 shells a day. The U.S. is ramping up to produce more than 20,000 shells a month this year and more in 2024, said the U.S. Army. But America's adversaries can do the math and understand the U.S. may struggle to support a long war. The Biden crowd has cited limited stocks as a reason to withhold the Army tactical missile system, which could help Kiev strike deep into Russian positions. The administration is now leaking that it might furnish missiles as Ukraine's summer offensive becomes a slog. So there you have it. A month ago, they were admitting, the neocons were admitting that this is no longer an offensive. This isn't we are charging forward with a very precise amount of time that we want to get this done. We want to defeat the enemy. In fact, it is back to a slog, meaning it is Russia's war of attrition that is winning out. So Congress's supplemental cash for Ukraine is helping refill America's armory, but Biden has an obligation to make sure the U.S. never goes Winchester, as the saying has it. And not only for Ukraine, the lesson applies to the long-range missiles the U.S. may need if China decides to strike Taiwan. So as I said, they're concerned about whether they can wage war on China while they're doing this with Russia. So this is what is happening, right? There are huge pushes. I don't need to read the rest of this op-ed because that gets to the crux of the matter. The huge issue is that the U.S. is out of weapons. There's not enough training. There's not enough manpower. Ukraine is not going to be able to overcome these challenges because the U.S. and NATO countries can't move fast enough to supply Ukraine with another army as it's about to burn through another one. And what do I mean by that? Well, Ukraine was already short of ammo, short of manpower. They were drafting, I'm not kidding, they were drafting 16-year-olds, elderly. This has gotten really, really ugly. And the casualty numbers, this is from Telesur, the estimated number of casualties in Ukraine's counteroffensive written August 4th, so not too long ago. So the Russian Foreign Ministry reported that the Ukrainian military has lost 43,000 troops since launching its counteroffensive in June. 43,000 troops. And this includes not just the troops that have been killed or injured, and Russia is saying they have been killed, that this is 43,000 killed. So there are probably more casualties in terms of injured. But this has also included more than 4,900 pieces of Ukrainian army's diverse armament being destroyed, 26 aircraft, 9 helicopters, over 1,800 tanks and other armored fighting vehicles, 25 German-made Leopard tanks, 7 French AMX wheeled tanks, and 21 American Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. So those are the consequences, and that is going to be the result from here on forward. There is nothing that the United States and NATO can do to turn the tide in this way. NATO does not want to dip in. These countries do not want to dip into their entire stockpile, lest they forget that the neocon foreign policy establishment is not just trying to wage a war on Russia through Ukraine. It is trying to militarily encircle Russia in totality. It wants its fellow NATO members to be able to launch a possible war on Russia should one come to be. It wants to continue to militarize the African continent, as we've seen with developments in Niger, in order to be able to control resources there and beat back the presence of Wagner and also the presence of China economically and Russia economically too. It wants to continue to militarize the Asia Pacific, which is project number 1, so that it can continue to escalate with China to build up toward a war there. So there are many priorities, right? These are the priorities of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, of NATO, and Ukraine is not going to be able to get everything it wants in order to achieve its objectives, nor would it likely be effective, because that would be seen as a major move of desperation, and Ukraine has already shown and proven that it is not capable of using these weapons in a manner that allows it to be as efficient as it could be. It's just not an efficient fighting force. This is why this war was always Russia's to win, and that is why the fantasies of the neocons, this neocon fantasy of a Russia defeat at the hands of Ukraine, has been crumbling ever since the beginning of the war, but now it has come to a head. Now the climax is here, and the collective West itself cannot help but admit the problem, and that problem is that Russia is going to win. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.